Greetings everyone. How's everybody doing today? Good to see you here. We're a little after 1 o'clock, so we better get started. Thank you for joining us here at the Air Museum. Thank you to all our guests today. Thank you to those that are watching at home as well. Appreciate you tuning in for our program series. This is about our third one here this season, Pearl Harbor, and now here we are with our third program. We're going to be talking about the Viking Battalion and their secret missions of World War II. But before we get into that, I would ask everybody present to please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
To the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Could I ask those that have served our country in uniform to remain standing? The rest may be seated. Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for our freedom. We appreciate it. All right. Well, let me tell you a little bit about our featured speaker today, and I want to thank him for making the trip down here in these interesting times in which we live. Our speaker today, Erik Brun, grew up in Santa Barbara. He retired from the Army National Guard in 2011, having served with California, Arizona, and the DC Guards. He received his BA from UCSB, an MBA from the University of Laverne, and an MA in Public History from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. He is president of the 99th Infantry Battalion World War II Educational Foundation, which I guess would make him rather qualified for our talk today.
Sure.
He is now a graduate student in history at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and serves the California National Guard as a member of the State Guard's Military Museum Command. He lives in Morro Bay with his wife Heidi, herself a 28-year veteran of the Army National Guard, and we thank her as well for her service.
Sure.
So won't you folks please welcome our featured speaker today, Mr. Erik Brun.
Thanks so much. Cool. Thank you all. I really cherish this opportunity to be here and speak with you and share with you something that is very close to my heart, and I think is a part of history that has been overlooked, and I'm working to rectify that. As we mentioned, the 99th Infantry Battalion was a Norwegian-American battalion that trained as ski troops at Camp Hale, Colorado with the 10th Mountain Division in 1943. And before I go more into that, just kind of general stuff, we all have different backgrounds, and I have to say, after 32 years in the Army, as I began to learn and try to unpack my father's career, I found that there were a lot of subtleties there that have changed over time. So just some words to try to put into perspective for you. The Army in World War II, the Army at that time was really based on the regiment. A soldier would have an entire career in their regiment during peacetime. And a regiment was about 3,200 officers and men. It was made up of 3 battalions, but those were kind of like subdivisions of that regiment. They didn't exist outside of the regiment. That was the chunk that they were part of. There was another 620 some odd soldiers, logistics, specialties, cannon company, anti-tank company, medics that were attached to bring it up to the 3,200. Those regiments also didn't necessarily normally fight alone either. They were fought as part of a division. And a division was 14,000 soldiers. And this particular illustration shows what the array of the 30th Infantry Division would be, with 3 regiments along the front line, and each of those supported by artillery and anti-aircraft artillery and medical units on a habitual basis, as well as units that are in general support that can be pushed up or provide support from where they are. So the reason this particular slide caught my eye is that they had actually put separate battalion in their picture. Now the 99th was a separate battalion. That's why it has that little extra thing. It's telling you that it's not part of a bigger organization. This is separate from the normal operation. So they're actually a larger unit, about 900 soldiers. They actually had logistics, administrative, and medical folks directly part of their organization so they could operate, things that they would normally receive from their regiment. So that just needed to explain what that meant. And of course, the divisions didn't fight alone either. Divisions, 2 or more divisions would become a corps, and a corps would become part of an army. Okay, there is the army. That's the team, that's the guys that play Navy, right? Everybody. Then there is a numbered army, 1st Army, 2nd Army, 5th Army, 8th Army. So that, and an army is made up of corps, so it's all stair-stepped. So, where my story starts, okay, I grew up with my father. I heard him, jabber in the background, but he was a grown-up and I wasn't, so it didn't really matter. Didn't really pay attention. And honestly, I managed to do that for 32 years. I didn't pay attention to what he was saying. But he gave me a call and he said, look, Mom and I are coming to DC. We've been invited to come for an event in DC for Memorial Day 2011. So here we are sitting on the National Mall on Memorial Day. I'm wearing a hat that I had prepared for my dad to wear. And the reason I'm saying that is that hat has the combat infantry pin on it. I'm not a combat infantryman, and I don't attempt to wear that badge. The only reason I'm wearing it is my dad was embarrassed. So, but I was proud to wear it for him. And that's my wife on the other side of Dad there. But here is the event that we went to the mall for. So Gary Sinise, of course, Gary Sinise lives at the mall. He's either at one of the 3 monuments at any one time, but he was there to present the flowers, the wreaths, other people there to play musical instruments. But what also happened that weekend was my father was among 25 soldiers that were brought to the Norwegian embassy to receive the Norwegian Defense Medal.
High up in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, you can find a few reminders of the 99th Battalion Separate, a Viking battalion of 999 members, and the 10th Mountain Division of 14,000 soldiers and officers. They trained here for winter warfare for 9 months before they were shipped to Europe.
I'm Ulaski Jumper from Norway to fight for the USA. I joined up the mountain battalion, and here I think I will stay.
We were told we were going to Scotland and train with Norwegian commandos and then attack Norway.
Very much alive, German army gathers forces from the Forest Isles to strike one strong, decisive blow at the American army.
Kampene inn mot selve Kjerne-Tyskland, så ble Aachen et viktig punkt. Der ble 99. bataljon satt inn og kjempet svært tappert.
Patton was to our right as we was fighting in Normandy, and then north of us was the British.
It was a rough time.
Skal man vinne en krig, så må man vinne en krig med hjertet.
My father died when I was 12. He very much wanted to come to America. My mother, on the other hand, did not want to come over, but she was a good sport. She came with him, and I was 2 years old at the time that we came in 1923. There was another unit there, the 10th Light, which was America's first ski division. And we trained with them, alongside of them, with skis and all the same tactics. I was eager to train and to be part of the organization. I realized that it was a very important thing. When we paraded, we had a Norwegian flag, an American flag. America was showing us that they cared about Norway.
You know, it really was back in 1945. I was just a kid. And I remember when the king came back on the 7th of June, and my brother and I, he's a year younger. I was almost 5, he was 4. And the whole family, except my aunt, she was 14, she and my brother and I were not allowed to go to Oslo with the rest of the family because all of Norway is going to be there.
Sjaluppen ligger klar, og kongen går fra bordet, fulgt av kronprinsesse Märtha.
It could be a month or 2 later, we were in Oslo for some kind of a victory parade or something, and then I remember you saw the Yankee soldiers. I knew they were Norwegian-American soldiers, but never gave it a thought again until I came out here. And my son and I said, let's go up to Ski Cooper. It's a nice little area. Let's go up there and ski. So we went up there to ski, and it happened to be on the skiing day for the 99th and the 10th mountain. And I had a Norwegian flag on my jacket, which I always have. And here come one of these guys in all white, you know, he had his whites on from the war, and said, are you Norwegian? So I said, yes. Or it was like I was the long-lost son, you know, finally he had found me. And he gave me patches and stickers and all kinds of stuff about the 99th. That's when I realized I had probably seen him before. I probably seen him in Oslo in 45. I didn't know what the 99th was, and, you know, I had no idea. It could be 5, 6 years later. They found out there was 1,000 guys here, you know, either Norwegian or Norwegian descent that had trained out there.
I'm delighted to be here today to award the 99th Infantry Battalion veterans with the World War II Participant Medal, the Viking Battalion.
There are just a few soldiers and officers of the 99th Battalion Separate that are still alive today. In May of 2011, the Norwegian government awarded the War Participant Medal to the members of the 99th Battalion that are still among us. The ceremony was held at the Norwegian Embassy in Washington, D.C., 70 years after the battalion was established in Minnesota.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most honorable thing that has ever happened to me. I'm gracious and thankful.
So this was a package deal, and all of a sudden, you know, I was, you know, trying to come to terms with what's the big deal. He's my dad. He's a nice guy. But Dad was a university archivist. He was at UC Santa Barbara. He was head of special collections. He spent his life in rare books, rare maps, documenting history, articulating history, and studying history. So when his son turned out to be dyslexic, that was a bit of a frustration, because though I could be excited about what he's talking about, I had trouble sharing it with him, because it was a lot of hard work to try to decipher all of these things he was trying to talk about. So who was he? Christianmundus from Brun. He was born in central Norway, a little bit above Trondheim. He came to the United States in 1923. He was the only child of Aga and Petra Brun. His dad had died in 1932 of influenza when he was working in a sawmill in Washington State. So he and his mom did the best they could. She ran a rooming house. He worked with her. He also worked at Haberdashery in Everett, Washington. He was for his junior high school and high school days. He graduated on December of 1939 and attended University of Washington. So what happened before this picture was in April of 1940, Norway was invaded. The Germans took Denmark and Norway. They took Denmark in one day and they attacked Norway the same day. So from that day in April of 1940, he was trying to figure out how he could get involved. So as it turned out, in the 1920s, aliens who had been a large part of the American soldiery in World War I were excluded from service. They could not volunteer for the military. When the Selective Service Act was drafted, they could not be drafted either. So what happened was he began to try to find other opportunities. So he found out that the Free Norwegians in England had gone to Canada and set up a program called Little Norway. And Little Norway was an aviation training program for the fighter and bomber squadrons that the Norwegians were running out of the UK. So he applied for that. But on December 7th, 1942, so a year into the war after Pearl Harbor, it was a Saturday, and he received his draft notice. So Selective Service finally caught up to him. He received the invitation from the Norwegian government on Monday. He had both in hand. As a matter of fact, the Selective Service state that their rules said that if you were a foreign national, you could serve with your national force if you chose to. You had first right of refusal there. But he grew up in the United States. He felt he was an American. He had first papers, but he did not have a citizenship. So he decided to go with that. So in honor of that, I wear his identity bracelet. I had an epiphany again last year. I was sitting here looking at this bracelet, and I realized that his mother, the widow, had put her family name on it. So when she sent her only son off to war, she had her name on him. So what I began to do, another thing happened in 2011. I retired. So after 32 years, they said I couldn't play with the toys anymore. I began to move on. So I began to look for secondary sources. As it turned out, there were a number of authors who were doing things. A daughter had produced a book called Red Wells. Red Wells was a replacement into the unit. There's a Norwegian author, a good friend of mine named Frode. Frode produced the book, let's see, here it goes, if I can get it right. The War on the Northland's Trains, or Northland Railway. So I actually had the opportunity to assist him on some technical aspects of that book. But this book, which was actually written by Gerd Nyquist. Gerd Nyquist was a Norwegian author, also a member of the Resistance, and she was known as a crime author. But she took the time to do a bunch of oral histories, interviews, and she published in Norwegian a book called the Battalion 99, and has since been republished in English as the 99th Battalion. So those were all good things. There's also another part of the story we'll get to later, but there's another line of books having to do with the OSS, and these are three that are very good for that. But what I did, since we were living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I was recently retired, I started going out to the National Archives. Now, I had not done any historical classes since 1985. So I was kind of untutored and untaught, and I just started jumping into stuff. And I began to troll through the War Department files and start trying to make connections myself, and learned a lot. And That's why I'm here. So my thesis is that there were secret things about the 99th, and I'll try to share those with you, try to put them in perspective. The first secret was this man. Okay, Raymond Lee, he was an artillery officer initially, which is okay because I graduated from Fort Sill myself. But he was also the attaché in London, working for Ambassador Kennedy. He became a back channel of information to the War Department. Ambassador Kennedy was not very pro-British, and he certainly didn't feel that the British stood a chance once the war started turning against them. Now another December 7th comes in here. After 2 years as the attaché working with the British Army, working with their Imperial War Department, he came back to the United States. He arrived in New York on the 7th of December 1941. His next duty assignment was to be an assistant to the Army's G2, the intelligence officer at the national level. So he instantaneously became the acting G2 because the primary G2 was sent to South America on a long tour into retirement, and shortly thereafter became the assistant chief of staff for intelligence G2 for the War Department. So he served there for only 6 months, but in those 6 months he did something that would have a kind of ripple effect out in the pond. One of those things, while he was in England, one of the things he witnessed was things like this. Okay, the Norwegian army in exile was rebuilding in Scotland. They were trying to scrape together every Norwegian they could get their hands on, and they were fighting with the Norwegian Navy and the Air Force, and they were also fighting with their Merchant Marine. By the way, the Norwegian Merchant Marine was 25% of the Allied Merchant Marine, starting near the war. So within that world, the Special Operations Executive, these were the ungentlemanly warfare specialists that Churchill chartered. They turned to the Norwegians and said, we would like to develop an independent company. An independent company was an idea that worked very well in Norway during the brief campaign there. Small, irregular combat type units. So the Norwegian Independent Company #1 was led by Captain Martin Linge, and he was killed actually on one of their raids back into Norway, and the company was later named for him. But that really kind of showed an example. Here is a company that was formed and given to the British Special Operations Executive to do missions back into Norway. As a matter of fact, if you watch Heroes from Telemark, the Norwegians involved were off of the rosters of Company Linge. So, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, General Lee writes this memorandum, and I'll share copies with you. Man, would you be so kind? So it is titled, "The Creation under the Auspices of the War Department of an International Combat Force Recruited of Aliens in the United States." And that is the first staff paper. They continue to be recycled. The next one was Proposed Establishment of American Foreign Legion, International Combat Force of Aliens in the United States. Well, these concepts matured, and they turned into, by August 1942, the 99th Infantry Battalion. But that wasn't the only thing. In April of 1942, the 1st Philippine Infantry Battalion was activated at Camp San Luis Obispo, California. It grew by May into an infantry regiment, and then they started a 2nd regiment. These soldiers would go on, they would be cadred, they would be tasked for additional, for personnel to also flesh out the first Special Reconnaissance Battalion in the Pacific. So that is one lineage for you. Of course, the 99th, the Japanese who belonged to the Hawaii National Guard and were segregated out of the combat units after Pearl Harbor, were brought back to the United States, and on 15 June they got off the boat and became the 100th Infantry Battalion. The 101st Battalion was comprised of Austrians, which was considered a acceptable German kind of political dodge there. I'm trying to say that it's the Sound of Music trick. That they have their own story. Many of their members became military intelligence interrogators and interpreters. The 102nd Greek, later renumbered the 122nd because that's the anniversary of independence that was coming up, and they wanted to make that kind of line up. The Greek battalion was eventually absorbed by the Office of Strategic Services. And lastly, the Richie Boys. Camp Ritchie, Maryland was the military intelligence training center just north of urban DC. And Camp Ritchie had about 14,000 graduates. About 30% of them were Hebrew or Jewish. The vast majority of them were recent exiles fleeing Germany. So these people not only bring the German language, but they bring in the native language. Many of them had been in the military before and brought in multiple levels of understanding. You know, they could tell a Bavarian from a Berliner from someone in the Saxony. Very powerful tools there. So the Richie Boys, there's a great documentary out there called The Richie Boys, if you get a chance to see it. And by the way, Foreign Legions was the file name that ended up being used for those guys. So that's the ripple effect out of that one staff paper that was put forward by General Lee. Now we're over. Camp Ripley, Minnesota, they activated the 99th Infantry Battalion. Eventually, over 900 soldiers. 900, and this is something that, show of hands, how many people lived in a Norwegianish culture, like Minnesota or somewhere? You had a couple of you, okay? When I grew up in Southern California, I knew my dad was Norwegian. I didn't know what that meant. I've since I started listening to Prairie Home Companion, and it was very funny in this. I tried to get my dad to listen to it. He didn't go for it. For him, it was a documentary. So the way I try to explain to people is the Army did an experiment. They took all of the stubborn people in the Army and put them in one unit, and they just happened to be Norwegian. So squareheads, as they were called, were well known to be pretty stubborn people. So the unit starts at Camp Minnesota, gets moved down to permanent buildings down at Fort Snelling, which is right next to the Mall of America, as a matter of fact. If you want to try to figure out, it was actually on the end of the trolley line, so you could get into town really easy. They had a great time, lots and lots of lutefisk and lefse. But that all passed because the Army had been building the Mountain and Winter Warfare Center at a new base. In 6 months, they built a 15,000-man city once the permafrost melted enough to be able to start construction. So from April to November, they built the city that includes sewer, electricity, the barracks, the warehouses, the railhead, everything. So in December of 1942, the 99th arrives at Camp Ripley. And to show you how accelerated things were, my father was drafted on the 7th of December 1942 and processed in Seattle, Lewis, Washington. He was at Camp Hale in time for Christmas dinner in December. So basic training was conducted OJT. You just, the sergeant's business was to make those soldiers up to snuff. So as that battalion, newly formed battalion, was doing its training, they were doing basic training simultaneously to tactical field exercises. Then they had Camp Hale. Camp Hale, the buildings at Camp Hale were at 9,300 feet. The mountains surrounding Camp Hale were over 12,000 feet. And training was uphill both ways. Okay, soldiers had 70 to 95, 98 pound rucksacks. They had skis, they had snowshoes, they had, you know, a never ending, and then they had to do army stuff too. So this was a very difficult set of training that occurred. But at the same time, as they were finishing their training, a couple of things happened. Ma'am, if you did such a good job the first time. Oh, he did? And he's taking it away from me again. So, but I'll give you the credit. She's off. So, something happened. And what that something was, let's see here. What that something was the 99th Battalion was trucked down to Camp Carson, Colorado, and joined the Greek Battalion that was already there, and they were reviewed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So you kind of have to wonder, how secret is that? Well, if I let's see here. Oh, there it is. Okay. If you have a chance to look at that, if you had a chance to look at that first handout on the memorandum, what General Lee had proposed were the goals of his program was, one, to take advantage of an intense desire to fight in these foreign nationals living in the United States. In the case of my father's example. Also look to the propaganda value as a way to present the United Nations not only to American citizens, but to the other countries of the world, and to the Germans. Then also what soldiers who were already trained and motivated could be used for espionage, sabotage, and military intelligence purposes. And finally, to act as the important elements of the force on the ground in that country once we're able to invade. So, and by the way, they're in the military intelligence game. There is white propaganda and black propaganda. There is offensive and defensive operations, intelligence, counterintelligence. It's all a box within a box within a box. Was it a coincidence that an article about the 99th appeared in an Australian newspaper at the same time Operation Mincemeat, which was the man who never was, the body who showed up magically on the shores of Spain? Was that a coincidence that a distraction toward Norway, underlining a Norway mention, and the man who never was, which was pointing towards Sardinia? All of those things were around Operation Husky, was the invasion of Sicily. So I'm out there looking for any of these connections I can find. how the 99th could have been used in political warfare and also in the intelligence worlds. So Camp Hale was closest to, if you go to the ski industry at Breckenridge, you go due south, you'll find Camp Hale just south of Camp Hale. There's Leadville, the famous mining town. Well, that was the closest town, and The GIs got there a bunch. The Silver Dollar Saloon became quite famous because one of the 99th guys threw an MP through the front window. As it turns out, that MP shows up like 6 times. As I'm doing history, this guy keeps popping up. So, but it was also the courthouse. So in this particular case, 58 members of a battalion of 1,000 were getting their citizenship in one day. And that occurred on a weekly basis throughout the summer of 1943. Okay, there's the presidential review. Sorry about that. So, in order to cover everything, I'll just give you the down and dirty. The unit went to Europe. It went to England in the fall of 1943. 22 days after, or 2 weeks after D-Day, they landed in Normandy. They actually had the opportunity to ride out that horrible Channel storm in the Channel on cargo ships. But they arrived in there. They were attached directly to 1st Army headquarters as a separate battalion, as kind of an extra force that they could use. They were initially attached to the Provisional Ranger groups led by 5th Ranger Battalion after D-Day. They provided area security in the Normandy Peninsula. Then they were attached to the 2nd Armored Division in Elbeuf, which is north of Paris. They secured a river crossing across the Seine in Elbeuf. They joined the 2nd Armored through the Canal Drive, which takes you up through a series of canals in Holland and Belgium in the north in September of 44. Then they transferred, because 1st Army owned them, 1st Army could move them to different units, and they would to wait an attack. So at Aachen, which was the first German city to fall to the Americans, the 99th was added to the 30th Infantry Division and was actually the northern pincer when the 1st Infantry and the moved up, and then the 30th drove south. That pincer to the east of Aachen was the bag that they were holding tight as the Germans tried to push through reinforcements into the city or extract forces out of the city. And if you can imagine having friendly forces on opposite sides of the same street with the Germans running down the middle of it, trying to get through, it was a pretty hard time. So then the battalion was called back, and it was again called by 1st Army headquarters as an emergency task. On the 17th of December, they were given a 2-hour warning to be on the trucks and heading south to a town called Malmedy. And Malmedy is a small town, but it sits on a bunch of river crossings. At Malmedy, Task Force Hansen, led by the battalion commander of the 99th, reinforced with the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion, met up with the engineer battalion commander who was holding those bridges. And the engineers were very happy to see the infantry at that point. Later that day, the 30th arrived, and the 99th it became part, for the next 30 days in deep winter operations, became part of the defense of Malmedy and Stavelot in that part of the line. So in this I took this out of the 12th Army Group's situation maps. So you have Bastogne in the south and the trace of the original front lines when the bulge started. But the 99th held its ground for almost a solid month there. What they didn't know while they were there, that they were actually supposed to be somewhere else. There had been a plan in the works since 1943, so over a year, that their name was on, but that they had never been told. So that plan was what the Allies were incredible planners. So they were looking at, what are we going to do when we get to Norway? However we're going to get to Norway. Is this going to be an opposed operation? Is this going to be the Germans run and we move in? Is this going to be the Germans surrender in place? So they had op plans for all that. And there was discussions in October 43 and the 99th was added to the plan for Operation Rankin, for what they call a token force of Americans. Norway was in the British sphere of influence and part of their part of the map. So bringing the Americans in was kind of, they had to bite their tongues on this one. But they asked us in because they wanted to make sure that they had their support. The whole other intelligence story about that, another story. But well, first of all, I know I'm just kind of blasting you, but does anybody recognize anything? You know, the military is all about gang signs. Every patch means something. Does anybody recognize any symbology in this insignia? Okay, there's three elements. You've got the Viking ship, that's a pretty easy guess. But you have a black ribbon here, and then the total patch is a red arrowhead. Does anybody recognize any of those other two gang signs? Okay, the red arrowhead was because the rest of the regiment was made out of the 1st Special Service Force. This was the Devil's Brigade. They had their own movie. This was a unit originally formed because of an absolutely crazy operational plan to land small teams and attack the hydroelectric facilities in Norway to try to cripple it. That turned into a unit. That mission was canceled, but the unit kept going. So this unit ended up going to the Aleutians. It ended up going fighting in Italy, in southern France. It has its own history. It has its own following. Well, another piece of that story was, while that unit was on Anzio, Darby's Rangers, so there were originally first 1 Ranger Battalion. This was an American battalion that was created in England, went through the British Commando School, and went to North Africa as a Ranger Battalion. They did a great job. They said, that's great, make 2 more. They created 3 battalions out of replacements and grit. That Ranger force went to Anzio and was destroyed at the Battle of Cisterna. 2 battalions were destroyed. 1 battalion was what they call decimated. But out of those soldiers, 900 survivors were in turn put under the wing of the 1st Special Service Force and were incorporated into that unit and continued to fight the rest of the war with them. So in 1945, the regimental commander, who had been the XO of the 1st Special Service Force during that period, wanted to give a shout out, wanted to recognize the fact that those Rangers were still here. Originally it was 900. By January of 1945, there were still 400 of them in the 1st Special Service Force. So he included their heraldry, or their insignia, on this patch. So this new regiment was created. They actually pulled back to Normandy and created it there. And they were given 3 months to become a combat-ready infantry regiment. None of them had ever been in an infantry regiment before. They had been in elite units. In the case of the 99th, they'd been ski troopers, but they had never been in a regiment before. And to make matters worse, halfway through that period, they got they got tagged with another mission, which was they were to become an anti-werewolf unit. Has anybody heard, in a World War II context, what a werewolf was? The Germans were falling back. The party faithful, the SS, decided to create a program they called werewolves. And the werewolves were supposed to go to ground. They were supposed to become the insurgency, kind of like what we saw in Iraq after the period of the initial occupation. You had in Good Friday of 2004, when my wife was there, all of a sudden 4 bridges were dropped in Baghdad itself in one day. And every convoy on the road was a target. That's what the werewolves were supposed to be. So in reaction to that, in anticipation of that, they turned around and tagged this regiment, made it a motorized regiment, gave it light tanks, gave it armored cars, gave it trucks, to be able to be a screening force to run around and take care of situations behind the lines. So the regiment itself, it had kind of an interesting history. They moved up to Aachen in April of 45. They were immediately sent on 2 different missions, and one of them I failed to include here. A security force and medics were sent to Buchenwald, and they were there the day that Eisenhower and Patton were there. As a matter of fact, some of our soldiers are in the pictures, and they remember that Margaret Brooke White was directing them to stand in the right places so that the ovens were framed properly. So that was one of the missions. The other is the Mercury's Mine. Has anybody seen the movie The Monuments Men? Okay, the Monuments Men, these were folks who were involved in protection of arts and treasures and things, but one of their things was to follow the gold and to follow the treasures, and that led them to Mercury's Mine. And this was a stash of 100 truckloads of gold, 480 tons of gold, Nazi gold. It was also the Reich's gold deposit, but there were also sacks of gold from fillings. There was jewelry, there were glasses, but that entire cash was moved out in 2 convoys, both secured by battalions of the 474th, the 1st Battalion and the 99th. But the end of that deal is they were able to take that regiment. Now the Germans surrendered initially on the 7th. The Russians wanted it to be the 8th, so it made sense in their calendar. On the 7th, there were already orders redirecting the regiment to be mobile, to move to the fort, to load on LSTs, to go to Norway. So now the execution of the Rankin Plan, now called an Apostle Plan, they were able to be in Oslo in time for the reception of the King of Norway and the royal family. The young man behind the king there in uniform, that is King Håkon VII, and Crown Prince Olaf is the next king of Norway. But they arrived. The Americans were the 99th was the honor guard at the dock when he got off. But the heart of the blue collar reason that they were there was there were 350,000 Germans still in Norway. One of the intelligence operations that was going on during the war was efforts to keep them there, to try to keep on pressure, keep on threats to Norway. Hitler had this thing about Norway, so every time they could say something about Norway, he would freeze troops in Norway or perhaps reinforce Norway. Well, any soldier in Norway is one less one in France. So, but there are 350,000 Germans of all services, 86 U-boats, 350 aircraft, 90,000 Russian POWs scattered across 400 camps, doing everything from the German Colonel Stryver to slave labor in the far north, laying rail or cutting roads, and an additional 30,000 foreign nationals. So the process had to be in place to expatriate them, bring them back to the country. The other thing the Americans were there for was what we would call soft power today. For the parades. There were no less than 3 major parades in Oslo that summer. And if you take a picture, you take a look at a wartime photo of German soldiers marching through Oslo, there's nobody there. The civilians just trying to get out of the way. They packed the city. The Americans the Norwegians really loved the Americans being there. So that brings the 99th story back to the veterans. So this was the group that I fed. That very weekend, I got recruited to join the board of a new foundation. The 99th Foundation took over from the 99th Veterans Organization. What this brought me to is the whole other story, because that half of the story was the battalion, but there was another story. And I had mentioned it once before, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. This is the predecessor to the CIA. The OSS, and by the way, that is Disney art that was commissioned for the operational groups. And the operational groups were a specific part of the OSS. So what the operational groups was, groups of, the base group is about 40 soldiers and officers. They're the grandfathers, and actually, if you want to get technical, the bastard grandfathers of the Special Forces today. I say bastard because the OSS was a civilian organization. The Army lineage will not follow a civilian organization. So these were soldiers who were attached to a civilian organization, and that's all they care about. You know, you can't draw the line there. But they were trained to operate by air and by land. I had mentioned that the 102nd or 122nd Greek Battalion, the entire battalion was subsumed by the OSS. It became 6 operational groups. 3 worked in Greece, 3 worked in Yugoslavia. So they formed 2 operational groups. So they took 80 soldiers, became two Norwegian OGs in the United Kingdom. How do you get these guys somewhere? You need a special delivery service, the carpetbaggers. The 802nd and the 492nd Bomb Group, this was a high priority package delivery service for you. They operated highly modified B-24 bombers. They flew in single ship or maybe up to 3 or 4 aircraft missions. The pilot and navigator made their own flight profile. They would fly less than 1,000 feet. They would fly at night by the light of the moon. This is some of the modifications to the aircraft. The Rebecca radio antenna, you can see the shadow of it above the P in Playmate. But that antenna is a directional antenna. It had the Eureka transmitter, which was used by the Pathfinders and the OSS and Special Operations operatives. And it was a directional beacon broadcasting straight up. So it was very, very, very hard to intercept by German radio detection. But they would use that to home in on the drop sites. When I say highly modified, since you're flying at 1,000 feet, you don't need a belly gunner. So they took the belly turret out, and that's the upper right-hand photograph is what they call the Joe hole, because the Joes would drop through that when they were parachuting out of that aircraft at 500 feet at 120 knots. So you also see they have a bunch of packages there. They had cargo containers salvoed out of the bomb bays, the aircraft as well. So and they preferred to fly with the greenhouse front nose, either those older aircraft, or they actually removed the Bendix turrets from the aircraft and recreated the greenhouse nose for their later aircraft. What they did, on this map, you can just imagine the blue area is where the American forces and the British forces were contained in Normandy up until the breakout at Cobra. The red dots are where they jumped. So they jumped over 200 miles into enemy territory in groups of up to, say, about 12. Okay, 12 to 15 guys, sometimes smaller. The Norwegians, since this was a French, this was France, the French groups had the lead, so the Norwegians and the other groups provided soldiers to go on those jumps. So Percy Red, Percy Pink, and Patrick were all, and those are in this first tier of, those 3 were their first jumps. There were about 60 other jumps like theirs that were occurring at the same time. But the breakout from and that, ladies and gentlemen, is a 51 Mustang. So while they were jumping in here, the breakout is just getting to take place. They did not want to insert these teams until the breakout was certain. Then the Southern France operations began, and they began to try to link up. But what these guys were doing was turning that whole central part of France into no-go zones. All of a sudden, it was not possible for the Germans to drive down any road. They had to ensure that that road was clear, and they never knew which one was. So they also were dropped to preserve key targets. There were factories, there were power stations, or dams. They wanted to make sure that the Germans did not try to damage. They also acted as the conduit for supplies to the resistance and to train and go out and operate. One of the fatality the Norwegians had in these operations was a captain who was killed attacking an armored train. But just to show you, and I know you won't be able to read this, but I'll point out a couple of names for you. This is okay. So by December of 1944, the opportunity to work with the civilians that had an organized resistance at Christianmundus ended. Okay, there was no resistance movement in Germany that could correspond to what they had in Greece or Yugoslavia or France. So they said Norway's still on the table, so we'll keep one Norwegian operational group, and they ended up renaming it because the whole structure that managed all of these groups was being disassembled. So what they did is they said, you pick your group. So they went through the 80 guys, they got a pick team. They offered anybody who was not picked to stay to go on the Norway mission or did not choose to go on the Norway mission. They offered them a very simple army choice. They could either go to China as part of a new mission, or they could become replacements and get issued to the 82nd, the 101st, the 1st Infantry. And oh, by the way, if you go to China, you get 30 days in the States on the way. I talk about a high success rate of that offer. But these are the Norwegians that came out of the 99th out of the roster that did go to Norway at the end of the war. The names at the top, there's Lieutenant Colonel Bolin. He had jumped with Gavin on D-Day. He's on the same stick, not on the same aircraft. Second guy, Colby, Major. William Colby. Is this a name that sounds familiar to anybody? Head of the CIA later? Okay. Major Colby, and a list of other guys. One here I want to point out because he wrote a pretty good book. Lieutenant Hall. Roger Hall wrote a book called You're Stepping on My Cloak and Dagger. Highly recommended. It's pretty tongue-in-cheek, but it is the building of the operational groups and the employment of the operational groups, and specifically the Norway operation. But all of those red dots represent soldiers that were called together and trained together as part of General Lee's vision. Here's the products of the folks who did go to China. So they worked with the nationalist Chinese. They trained their commandos. They did airborne training for them, airborne operations. As a matter of fact, some of the Norwegians from this group ended up in Hanoi at the end of the war, chasing American POWs down. So, recap, this shows what the missions were. Operation Ripe, which was the American operation in Norway, was flying out of England all the way up into this area, the north central Norway. Tragically, in those extreme conditions, that extreme range, there were 2 aircraft lost in those missions. I have detailed discussion boards about those 2 aircraft here if you would like to take a look at them. This photograph was kind of a proof of ceremony picture taken at the request of Major Colby, who was the on-the-ground leader of the mission in Norway. They did manage to get to the railroads. They did blow up the tracks and delay German operations in March into April, and they were on the ground in Norway in May when the Germans surrendered. What we do, I was recruited into the foundation. I was quickly identified as gullible and groomed by the outgoing president to become the follow-on president. But our volunteers go to events. We use a series of posters like this to tell our story and to tell the stories of our parents, our uncles, and many new friends who come along to help us tell our stories. We work on erecting monuments. This is the monument at Camp Ripley, Minnesota, which is really important because not only was our initial activation site, but it is also the home of the Norex, or the Norwegian exchange program, that has been going on for over 40 years. For 40 years, the Norwegian Home Guard and the Minnesota National Guard have had a military exchange program. And the storyline of the Norwegian 99th Battalion have become a large part of that. You see a group in 2015 there that are reenacting one of the ski treks done by the OSS troops in Norway. 75-kilometer ski trip. I don't know how far they went, but the real one was 75 kilometers. We have another monument. This was erected by the veterans at Tennessee Pass in Colorado. There's a small county ski chalet there called Ski Cooper. Ski Cooper was Cooper Mountain, which was a training area built by the Army Corps of Engineers and the Quartermaster Corps for the Mountain and Winter Warfare Center. So that has been a go-to place. There are 2 events every year that take place here. Just to the left of that monument is the 10th Mountains Monument. So that site is shared. There is a ski event that occurs normally annually in February, March, and you see here members of the 10th Special Forces Group and the Special Forces Association joining in at that ski event. So they are big supporters for us. We really appreciate it, and they have deemed those events heritage events for themselves. The other event that happens annually there is Memorial Day, and there is the town of Leadville has adopted that as their Memorial Day event. So we really appreciate a chance to tie into that. Now, I was living in Virginia after we moved away from DC when the OSS Society's Congressional Gold Medal, or the OSS Congressional Gold Medal, was awarded. I was invited to go to the ceremony in DC. While I was there, I met a bunch of these carpetbaggers. And what do you know if they aren't nice guys? Well, it's finally dawned on me. The same defense medal that was awarded to my father and his compatriots for the 99th would also be able to be awarded to members who had participated in those missions into Norway in 1945. So this is the presentation here in Palm Springs, the presentation of commemorative medallions to the carpetbagger members. Shortly after that, we were able to get the King's signature on the awards of the actual medal. And here, Bill Becker, who is a local Southern California 95-year-old feisty member of the Carpetbaggers, he will proudly tell you he is the #1 top gunner in the 8th Air Force to this day. But this is the Admiral Sund, who is the defense attaché, and his aide presenting the medal to him a couple of years ago. I've since attended another carpetbagger reunion in Minneapolis and had a chance to talk with them. But this is why we do it. This is what the foundation is about. This is why we care. We are here to tell the story and try to collect it and be able to bring it forward for you. We are a 501c3, and I hope I've been able to tell you some stuff you've never heard of before. Really happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Erik. Does anybody have any questions? Got a question or two over here?
Have you any idea how many gentlemen are still alive from the 99th? There were 900, you said.
We're down to 5. The 99th, since the Army unit was assembled in 42, was a couple of years ahead of the carpetbaggers, so we're down to 5. And the carpetbaggers last reunion I was at with them, I think there were 8, 9 of their folks who were able to travel to Minnesota for that. There were certainly more members who couldn't travel at that point.
I think we've covered it, Erik. Thank you very much once again. Thank you, folks, and I want to thank everyone watching at home as well. Very enlightening, but I think we learned a lot today. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Greg.